For the best aerospace era, this is Mansplaining. Here's the host, Anthony L. Seeley.
Welcome, aerospace enthusiasts. You may have heard that 2026 is the 250th anniversary of our nation, the United States of America. There is one prominent name that will be brought up more often than others when looking back at our short but impactful history. That name is Neil Alden Armstrong. Now, 2026 is also the 60th anniversary of the eventful Gemini 8 mission, piloted by Armstrong himself. So I felt this was the perfect time to talk about the first man. Now, there is a museum in Armstrong's hometown of Wapakoneta, Ohio, where you can learn more about him and our aerospace history. My guest on this extra section episode is the curator and communications director of the museum which bears his name, the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. Welcome, everyone, Logan Rex.
Hi, how we doing?
Thank you for coming on Mansplaining. Before we talk about the museum, the exhibits, and Neil Armstrong himself, tell us about yourself and how you came to work at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Lima, Ohio, which was it's about 15 minutes north of here. So, Neil Armstrong was a real important piece of local history. So eventually, when I got my degree in political science and history, a position here came open. And, just being a history nerd, it was a great opportunity, but I had no real formal background in aerospace or anything like that. So it was a real, I think in the beginning, like I said, a baptism by fire that eventually turned into a real passion and a love for it. And I've been here, it's been going on 7 years now, and it's a blessing coming to work every day. I love what I do. I love the people here. We all have that same passion, that same need to tell more people about this amazing part of history and why it's so important still to America. So I think it's always a great thing if you feel like you're never working a day. And these past 7 years, I don't think I've worked probably a single day because I just love, if I wasn't, I'd be volunteering here. I mean, it's a great area that I'm very happy in, and I feel very fulfilled in my work. So, but I am the curator and communications director, so I'm in charge of exhibits and also the marketing and other communication strategies here for the museum.
Now, this is my first time visiting here, so I'm excited to hear about the exhibits. But first, give me some background on the Armstrong Air Museum and tell us about its mission.
Yeah, so originally the museum was actually really founded on July 20th, 1969. Governor Rhodes, which was the governor of Ohio at the time, stood on the front porch of the Armstrong home the next day. So Armstrong was still on the lunar surface. And Governor Rhodes announced to the world that there would be a museum right here in Wapakoneta, which is obviously Armstrong's hometown, that this museum would dedicate the Apollo 11 mission and Armstrong and all the Ohioans that dared to defy gravity. So, I mean, that is how quick this museum, got off the ground. So the governor really wanted this to be a community achievement. So he said that the state would supply $500,000 if the community could raise the other $500,000. So altogether, in inflation terms, that's about $5-6 million that in total needed to be raised, and that he wanted it to be done in a year. So the community came together and they raised over $500,000. It was about $535,000, and within that, we started building within that year of 1970. So again, all of this is happening while we're still going to the moon. So, this achievement, this museum, is still happening while the Apollo program is still going to the moon. So, it's kind of amazing to think that this museum was being built for the moon landing while we're still having moon landings. So I always found that to be very interesting. And then we opened on July 20th, 1972. Tricia Nixon was here, sent by the president at the time, with the moon rock. So we have a moon rock here, and Tricia was the one to hand deliver the moon rock to the museum. And then there were some other things that we wanted in the museum, like the Gemini 8 spacecraft, some of Armstrong's spacesuits, things like that. And there's still some of our beautiful crown jewels to this day. So we were very lucky to have a lot of those amazing artifacts from the Smithsonian, from NASA, and they really wanted this museum to be successful as well. To my knowledge, I believe that we were the first Air and Space Museum to be named after an astronaut in the world. So that was very interesting. But yeah, so I think one of the things that when people come in, they really realize that, we might be a smaller museum in terms of, if you go to like the Air Force Museum or Kennedy Space Center, huge complexes. But if you come here, it's very manageable. And I think it's the artifacts and the story itself that really packs a punch. And I think we hold our own when it comes against those other larger institutions.
And I do want to just say for reference, Wapakoneta, I am saying that correctly, right?
That is right.
Awesome. Wapakoneta is about an hour and a half northwest of Columbus, Ohio, just for reference. Now, I know the museum is not just about Neil Armstrong, but let's start with him. There was much more to Neil Armstrong than just that one small step on the moon. What can we learn about his early life here?
Yeah, so like I said, Armstrong was born about 5 miles south of the museum on his grandparents' farmhouse. So he grew up a lot in the area. His father was a state auditor at the time, so he moved around a lot as a child. I believe over 13 times his father picked up and moved. And being an auditor for the state, they would go, live in a community as he would, audit their books, and then they would move to a new community. So I think that really also influenced Armstrong, sort of having that, I think it was hard for him growing up and moving so much, but that also just made him more focused on his own interests. So at the age of 3, from his parents' interviews, that's when he sort of really realized that he liked aviation. It was actually at the Cleveland Air Show that Armstrong got to see sort of the first airplanes that were coming about, and he had his first airplane ride in Warren, Ohio. At the age of 5, he was about to turn 6. And that really solidified that he wanted to have a career in aviation. He had a real passion for it. That's when he would start doing model airplanes. And eventually, when he was about 14, his parents moved back to Wapakoneta. So here you can see a lot of him forming that interest into a career. So he learned how to fly about 2 miles north of here in Wapakoneta. He graduated high school here. His parents lived here the rest of their lives. So anytime that he would come back to his hometown, that would be Wapakoneta. And, his parents watched the moon landing from here. So, and if you look at, it's always interesting. I know you were recently talking about Ohio astronauts and how they determine what is an Ohio astronaut. But usually the NASA application says hometown, and Armstrong put Wapakoneta as that home. So that was one big reason why, again, they wanted to have a museum here. And in terms of things like in artifacts, we have a lot from his childhood. His parents were a big influence on the museum. So a lot of the things that they had in their house, or if they wanted to donate to the museum, they would bring it here. So you can see things like the first airplane that he got his pilot's license in. His mom donated a bicycle to show that he had to bike to the airfield every day, because when you're 16, you don't have your driver's license. We have some other things from his college years, some college textbooks from when he went to Purdue, and then some other things like a Boy Scout patrol flag, and then some other small things like his science fair project was a wind tunnel. So we have some wind tunnel parts. So he wanted to have an experiment to see the sort of the aerodynamics of aircraft. So there's a lot of things that really show you that he had that true passion for aviation at a very young age. And it really started right here in Wapakoneta.
That's excellent. It's more not just aviation. They just don't want to fly. It sounds like his mind of an engineer, you can already see at a young age, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at a lot of the things that he was passionate about, you know, he was an avid reader. He was in the American Rocket Society, and you know that was before rockets were taking humans up. So he was really interested at a very young age. He had dozens of model airplanes that he would craft, and he even was part of a model airplane society into his college years.
I know I'm always interested about an astronaut's aviation career before he joined NASA, and I know we touched on it a little bit, but can you give us a little more about that?
Yeah, so like I said, he knew he wanted to get a pilot's license early. So it was about 2 miles north of here. It's called Port Connect, Ohio, and it was just an airfield. It was only up actually for less than 18 months before it went defunct. A lot of those airfields post World War II sprung up because they really thought that these Army Air Corps guys, these Air Force guys, wanted to sort of keep their skills. And so many of these airfields just popped up, but they really found that the demand was not there. A lot of these Army Air Corps guys had seen so much in Europe and the Pacific Theater that they were no longer really interested in keeping up their skills. But it was right around that time, 1945, 1946, that Armstrong was very interested in aviation, and he got that opportunity to get his pilot's license. He actually wanted to continue. He got his aeronautical engineering degree from Purdue, but he was also on the Holloway plan for going to school, which means he had to enlist in the Navy. So he did 2 years of schooling, 3 years of active duty service. He would go back into the reserves and then finish his schooling at Purdue. So again, he has a military background as well. So I think there was a quote out there from Armstrong, or at least when talking to his family, and a lot of astronauts will also say this, in terms of either a space mission or their first time landing on an aircraft carrier at night, that is way scarier. And a lot of them will tell you, when you go into space travel, you have America's top minds working behind you. When you're landing on an aircraft carrier, it's really just you, and you have to really be prepared for that. So that first time landing on an aircraft carrier, especially at night, you could see Armstrong was relatively nervous compared to going on a space mission. So he has deep respect for America's military, America's Navy, and those Navy guys, especially his time in the Korean War. There were a lot of his good colleagues that he lost, and being an astronaut is one thing, but seeing what you see in being a military veteran during war, he has a great, or had a great respect for those men and women that were fighting.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about Neil Armstrong, the astronaut. What do you have for us here?
Yeah, so in terms of being an astronaut, so Armstrong was selected in the second group in 1962. We have a lot of items in terms of that early selection, the training that's involved. Like I said, obviously we have probably one of our crown jewels is the Gemini 8 spacecraft. But Armstrong was also in NASA as a test pilot as well. So we have the F-5D Skylancer that's out on our front lawn actually, and that was used for the Dinosaur program, so the X-20 space plane, and so he was creating the abort launch maneuver that he was using, and I think to this day, there's only 2 F-5D Skylancers left in existence, and this is actually the only one that Armstrong flew. And I think altogether we have 4 craft that were flown by Armstrong, which I believe, from my research, is the most of any museum in the world. So that's also a great feather in our cap to have. But when it comes to being an astronaut, we have the Gemini 8 spacesuit as well. So I think one of the best things that we tell pretty well is that story of Gemini 8. If you go upstairs, we start going into Apollo as well. So we have a lot of things from the Apollo program. And again, there's some things from the Apollo 11 mission. We have things from other Ohio astronauts like Jim Lovell and some of the other sort of big names of the early space race. And like I said before, we had our Apollo 11 moon rock, which was picked up by Armstrong, and it's off of the largest sample collected on Apollo 11. So again, I mean, a lot of these artifacts really speak for themselves and really allow us to tell a very compelling, convincing, and interesting story. And, whether you're 5 years old, on a kindergarten field trip, or whether you're 70 years old and you're, a PhD, both people are getting the same experience, but both people really walk away satisfied, which is an amazing. If you can keep a 5-year-old interested and a 70-year-old PhD interested in the same story, you're doing something right. So I think our museum really does that well, and in terms of guest satisfaction, being able to have a very knowledgeable staff too. We have a lot of people working here that are telling that story and getting people interested and telling them a lot of stuff behind the scenes too.
That's excellent. I want to talk about the Gemini 8 because I actually reread Dave Scott's account from that mission. I know there's one time because they had a thruster malfunction, which started spinning the spacecraft, and it spun so much that Dave Scott said it looked like a strobe light. The sun was in there, and they were kind of thrown to the side because of the spin. And Neil Armstrong had to reach up while it's spinning without looking and flip this one switch to turn on the reentry thrusters, so that way it would stop the spin, which also meant the mission was ended. So I think Dave Scott was supposed to perform a spacewalk on that mission, but obviously with the malfunction, none of that happened, but it later worked out for both of them because they both walked on the moon. But this mission definitely showed Neil Armstrong's, way to work a problem. Now, I'm interested to know this about you and your staff. What do y'all think of the movie First Man, released in 2018? Do y'all think that was a good profile of Neil Armstrong?
Yeah, so back when the movie was, in development, Damien Chazelle, which was the director, and Ryan Gosling were actually here at the museum to do some further research for the Gemini 8 scene like you were talking about. So they were able to come here, Ryan and Damien, and I think also one of the prop guys were able to come in, sort of learn more about how to tell that story, because it's such an essential piece of Armstrong's story. And it's like how should this be done? How should it be? The way that it's being directed, and like you said, it's such a moment that this is one of NASA's first true in-flight emergencies. If Armstrong didn't execute this properly, they both would have perished in space, and that's a big chunk of reasoning why Armstrong was chosen as the first man on the moon, because he was so calm and collected under that emergency. And I think in terms of our contributions to that movie, I think it was very well done. Overall, I mean, it's Hollywood. Hollywood tells, a story that they want to tell. And in terms of accuracy, there's obviously a few things that the movie took liberties for. But, it was reassuring to know that, James Hansen, which is the official biographer for Armstrong, was on set a lot, talking to them, seeing how this should be done. I think there were some small roles that Neil's sons may have been in as well. So overall, I think it was a great way to get people interested in the moon landing and Neil Armstrong's life. Should it be taken as the end-all be-all as the accuracy? No, I mean that's usually any movie that you watch. I mean, if I read a book and then I watch the movie, you know, there's always like, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. Why did they do that? Why did they take this section out? And why didn't they go into this subplot more? You're always going to have some qualms with it, but overall, I think it was fine. Um, it I still watch that Gemini 8 scene, and I think they did a relatively good job in terms of showing the danger of that moment and Armstrong trying to remain calm.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the Gemini. I've actually seen Gemini 3, Gus Grissom's, and can't wait to see Neil Armstrong's now. Now, I know this museum is more than just about Neil Armstrong. What other aerospace figures do you profile here?
Yeah, so we really wanted to have a good focus on, Armstrong, but all Ohioans that dared to defy gravity. So we have in total around 26 Ohio astronauts that we like to highlight, and we have a good focus on the shuttle program. There's a lot of Ohioans. Let's like the I think it's STS-70, which was the All Ohio mission. So a lot of Ohioans. The old joke is, why are there so many Ohio astronauts? Because there's something about Ohio that makes you want to leave the planet. And we're very thankful to have such a rich history in aviation. Ohio has a good military background as well. We have a large number of veterans, and there's something where all of this combines to have great candidates for being an astronaut. So we have other things, like I said, from the shuttle program. We have a good focus on curiosity and some of the uncrewed missions to worlds beyond our own. And Ohio has the NASA Glenn Research Center as well, so it's one of the NASA facilities that do a lot of research for those missions and things. So it's not just the astronaut. There's a lot going on in the backgrounds, and even Armstrong. He really wanted to have this museum have a focus on all the engineers, all the crew, everyone that had a small piece in the progress of space exploration. And he thought that those people were just as important as the accomplishments he had in, his early space program and missions.
What is your personal favorite exhibit or aspect of this museum?
As the curator, you try to stay impartial. You try not to have favorite artifacts because you don't want to hurt their feelings. But if I had to choose, I really like walking by our moon rock. Just going through and seeing, this shiny, sparkly little rock that was at one point just on the lunar surface, and then one day it got picked up by a human being and brought back to our planet. It's an amazing journey, and it speaks volumes for just being an igneous rock. Seeing Armstrong's spacesuit and just a lot of the items that were so intimate to the missions, and they were so vital to the success of the missions. And I mean, like I said, I think one of the things that we do very well here is having such a wide variety of artifacts. It's very hard to pick out because each one has such an amazing story that I think I see so many different guests walk through, and they connect all to different artifacts. And someone would walk through and see a newspaper, and they'd be like, hey, that's from my town. So it's everyone has such a different way that they connect, and it's amazing to see how a newspaper from 1969 can move them in such a way, and be able to hear that story that they have. And there's so many people that walk through, and we get to hear their stories. What were they doing on the moon landing? And I think that's another reason why so many people like this museum, is that they get to relive that moment and reminisce, and it's a great way that we are able to give back to that story.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested to see the moon rock because I've seen a moon rock at the Johnson Space Center. It was very small. Definitely interested to compare. Do you have any big annual events here that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so every year we have what's called the Summer Moon Festival. So that's around the anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. The whole town sort of just shuts down and for that week, and we have a lot of interesting activities. Downtown has a lot of fun, community events. They have a beer tent. Here at the museum, we have a good focus on educational activities, a lot of fun outdoor activities. We get some like inflatables. We have, other museums come out and they're able to talk about what they do and their contributions to aviation, aerospace, STEM. And then we have some other events that are more annual. We have our Boo on the Moon event. That's usually that last Tuesday in October. So kids go through trick or treat through the museum. And then in the winter, we always have our holiday light display. So we have a large, I think we have over 200,000 lights, over, I think, 36 different just installations that show a variety of different fun, Christmas things, different space things. We have like the whole solar system up. We have, a Saturn V rocket as it. We have, the Apollo 11, saluting the flag. So there's a lot of fun things, and it's all free for like the holiday lights display. So it's just one of our ways that we give back to the community.
Awesome. Now, I need to bring this up because this is
Yeah.
how I came across you. You wrote an article back in December. But back in December, I was writing my episode called Ohio and Aerospace about, everyone from Ohio and the astronauts and different pilots from Ohio. When I finished recording that episode, I was going to edit it and upload it later the next day. I opened up Facebook, and right there, on my first thing on my social media feed, was your article, Why Are There So Many Astronauts from Ohio?
Great, yeah.
And I had one of those moments where I was like, my phone's spying on me. It has to be. Because I always have my phone next to me, nearby when I'm recording. I was like, it heard me. It's like, here, check this out. And I even looked it up. You wrote that article right around when I was recording that episode. But I wanted to bring that up to you, but also, since you're here, so why are so many astronauts from Ohio? And we can compare what you came up with and what I came up with on my episode.
Yeah, so, that's a question that we always like to get. And it's always interesting, too, because, first off, like for us, we consider 26 Ohioans as astronauts. And, there's always a difference between like a birthplace and a hometown. So some of these, astronauts weren't born in Ohio, but they consider Ohio as their home. So that's one key characteristic that, is always a stipulation. So, there's some astronauts that, like Greg Johnson, for example, he was born on an air base in the United Kingdom, but he's from Ohio. He put down, Ohio as one of his hometowns. And then there's the new nuance of, private industry and private astronauts, commercial astronauts. So like Larry Connor, for example, he was someone that was on the Axiom space crew. Axiom, I think it was Axiom 1. So he went to the International Space Station for, I think his mission was about 17 days long, but he was from Dayton. Now, he wasn't a NASA astronaut. So that's when we were starting to go into, okay, before we were just doing NASA astronauts, but if we go back into, FAA guidelines and definitions as to what it means to be an astronaut, commercial astronaut, space flight participant, and that's when you start getting into. So for Larry, for example, he was in space and he conducted experiments. There was a lot of geriatric experiments that he conducted, medical experiments, and he was on the International Space Station for about 2 weeks. Now that versus, let's say there was a gentleman from Ohio, I think his name was Paul Jarvis. He is considered a spaceflight participant because he was on one of the Boeing Blue Origin missions where it goes, up over the Carmain line, back down. So by that definition, you need some type of public benefit for your mission to be considered an astronaut now, and I think that's where we're drawing the line as to what an astronaut is. But again, Ohio, like I said, has those early requirements. You had to have some type of military test flight experience. Ohio has great a military background, a lot of veterans. Like I said, we have the NASA Glenn Research Facility here. So a lot of people in the Cleveland area would be familiar with that, and having that as an aspiration growing up in Northeast Ohio. So there's this great amalgamation of different things. Having that, and obviously like the Wright brothers. We have a large aerospace industry here in Ohio, and education. Education is very important. A lot of these Ohioans went to Ohio universities, or they were, again, having that military background. You'd be going to, West Point or the Naval Academy, things like that, or Purdue, because again, Purdue is only one state over, and it is the cradle of astronauts. They have the most astronauts of any public university in America. So, and that's where Armstrong obviously went. So, there's always a great number of factors that contribute. But overall, Ohio doesn't have the most, and Ohio doesn't have the most per capita. If you look at places like California and New York, they have I think around 30. And then there's places like North Dakota, where if you look per capita, if you have 2 astronauts from North Dakota, times that by the number of actual residents, they beat you out per capita. So really, Ohio just has, in terms of just astronauts who have the most impact, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell, Judith Resnick, and some of those other shuttle pilots that were in the missions. They really hold their own in terms of history. So Ohioans are probably, again, not the most, but we're good at making those milestones.
One other thing I mentioned in my episode was a backwards Wright Flyer license plate that Ohio released a few years ago.
Yeah.
Do you have one of those license plates with the Wright Flyer facing the wrong direction?
Yeah, it's so funny that you asked, actually. I collect license plates. So, I have some of the early ones from Ohio from like 1917 all the way up. And I called my friend and I said, you need to get me one of those backwards license plates, because I love it. As a license plate collector, this, I find it, everyone was freaking out because, if you don't know anything about aviation, you look at a Wright Flyer, you're like, oh yeah, that's the front, that's the back, but it's obviously not like that. But again, I think it was an honest mistake, and I think aesthetically it did look nicer backwards, but that is definitely not accurate. So overall, we thought it was funny. I think there were some people that were kind of worked up by it, but I think they made a couple thousand before they had to rescind them, put them back into production. So it was funny, I thought.
Yeah, I mentioned that'd be a great collector's item.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely ready to go have a look around now. And I will share my thoughts about Neil Armstrong and the Armstrong Air and Space Museum at the end of this episode. So stand by for that. But I want to thank the staff here, and I want to thank you for coming on Mansplaining.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor.
Now, I want to tell you about my impression of the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. I first noticed the unique shape of the museum itself. I learned that it was constructed to replicate a proposed moon base that was planned for the 1970s, but was never made. The exhibits and displays are presented from the earliest aerospace pioneers to the Soviet space program, then to our response with NASA, all the way up to the space shuttle program. All along this timeline are exhibits from Armstrong's life, like his bike that he rode, to the airplane he learned to fly on, to the Gemini 8. What an amazing progression of his life on display here. Also, the spacesuits, the moon rock, the infinity room, and the video in the movie theater are all a must see. And all of the staff that I met there were very hospitable and friendly. I highly recommend the Armstrong Air and Space Museum to everyone. Also, follow them on social media because they are always posting fascinating material. Now for Neil Armstrong. As I said before, his name will come up often as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation. And Armstrong's name will still be mentioned in the history books on the 350th, 450th anniversaries, and beyond. One interesting thing I learned about Armstrong was the aviation records he set in a Learjet 28 about a decade after his moon landing. He set a record in space before setting records here on Earth. Who else has accomplished that? I will end here with a quote from Armstrong himself. From the time of our birth, our instinct is to explore. To make new discoveries, we must explore. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, there's always a light at the end of the runway.
Follow Mansplaining for more stories from the best aerospace era, or go to bestaerospaceera.com or find us on social media.